You're listening to Skate of Thrones, your go-to podcast for dialed-in LA Kings coverage.
Welcome back to Skate of Thrones, the podcast that dials in on the Los Angeles Kings. As always, I'm your host, Casey Kasliner, here on Saturday night as the Kings take down the Nashville Predators in overtime. Final score 1-0. Yeah, you heard that right. A scoreless regulation, but the Kings win their fifth straight game, and probably one of the most boring Kings games of the year. I mean, you could really bring up the Buffalo Sabres loss earlier in the season to rival this one, but Kings on the right side of the scoreboard win their fifth straight. And Quinton Byfield, once again, the hero of the game, along with Darcy Kempe. Byfield scored his sixth goal in the last 6 games, bringing him up to 17 total goals on the year and 40 total points. And Darcy Kempe, back-to-back shutouts for him. And that's the first time, crazy stat, but the first time a Kings goalie has had back-to-back shutouts since 2018. And the last goalie to do so was Kempe himself. So really interesting stat there as Darcy Kempe once again holds a team scoreless. And I mean, you're coming off a game where you dominate the Washington Capitals, then you go ahead and play one of the worst teams in the league, the Nashville Predators, who, for the record, still do have some talent on their team, but of course have struggled a lot this year, haven't really been able to have it all click. And the Kings have been tested by the Predators before. The Kings beat them earlier in the year, but in the most recent matchup, LA lost in overtime. So it wasn't a free win by any means, but 2 points are 2 points, and I think that's what the Kings just have to keep repeating to themselves. Because of this offense, we know that, the Kings just rely on their defense to win them games, and that kind of causes games like this to happen where, you're just not going to get many solid opportunities. I mean, the Kings, I hate saying that because the Kings had opportunities, they just couldn't put them away. And they had 3 power plays, didn't score on any of them. But the penalty kill did its job, and that's a big reason for the win. I mean, you can look at Darcy Kempe and Quinton Byfield, but importantly, the penalty kill has been incredible recently, and in the month of March is just absolutely killing it. I mean, they've allowed 26 total power plays and have only allowed 2 goals total. And so not too shabby. And we've seen in the past few games, the Kings have not been very well disciplined. We're a bit better tonight, but have been able to kind of avoid the narrative that, they're a poor disciplined team and are giving up a bunch of goals, because they're not. And so, yeah, I mean, with Nashville too, you expected them to be kind of tired out. I mean, they're coming off a back-to-back, 2 games in 22 hours it was, and backup goaltender, Anunin. It's not a game that the Predators were favored in by any means, but the Kings, didn't make it easy for themselves. The Kings only had 6 shots over the first 2 periods with a few good looks, but I mean, they only had 1 shot on the power play. And it was from Brandt Clark from the point on the second power play unit. The Kings just couldn't do anything on the power play. It almost seemed like it would be more advantageous for them just to not get power plays because, they just weren't doing anything on them. And so, yeah, the Kings with the win also moved to 23-3-4 at home. That's the best in the NHL. And so, yeah, I mean, the Kings stayed resilient, and that's what matters. And, you play in overtime, that's hard to do. But for the team, I don't think this is a win they're necessarily bragging about. We'll get into the game action now. So the Kings, of course, get the 1-0 win and didn't have anything to really show for in regulation. The Byfield line continued to look good, even in regulation when the team didn't score. That was kind of like the only force the Kings had, that Byfield third line with Alex Laferriere and Kevin Fiala. And, Kevin Fiala and Byfield still looked really good as a duo themselves. I mean, it's looking like one of the more dangerous duos in the entire league with, Fiala really feeding Byfield well, and Byfield, playmaking on his own, allowing Fiala to create his own looks. And they really have a good relationship, it feels like. But the Kings, like I said, they just were so slow and flat-footed. They were overpassing. They weren't playing simple. They came in with 0 lineup changes, and we've kind of just seen that ever since the Kuzmenko edition, who, for the record, has not recorded a point yet. And Jim Hiller talked a little bit about Kuzmenko in the press conference, said, he, of course, wants Kuzmenko to get points, but he's a good addition to the lineup. He kind of kept it kind of straight with him, but the Kings just, came out really, really slow, had a few just kind of giveaway opportunities that weren't great either. Mikey Anderson in the press conference talked about the Kings turnovers, and so did Jim Hiller, how that's sort of just been a big problem, amid games where the Kings are not necessarily killing it on the scoreboard. The turnovers are the problem. It's really the issue, especially in the offensive zone where the Kings have looks and they give up the puck too easily. And so, yeah, I mean, only 2 shots on goal in the second period. That was the Kings' worst period. And we've seen them this year be a pretty bad second period team. Feels like, down the stretch, they've really accomplished more. And they showed that this game. They had a pretty good third period. And they started out the third with a power play chance as Quinton Byfield received a high stick at the end of the second. But they didn't do much with that. And then they were finally getting some shots. Tanner Jeannot hit the crossbar. And then from there, you could kind of tell, like, okay, the Kings hit the crossbar. They've hit the post a few times. This is like the moment where they can break things open. And Darcy Kemper, like through all this, was playing great. And you kind of had to feel bad for him because his team was not giving him any support. And he just, did great. Brant Clark played in overtime, helped set up what would be the game-winning goal. And, Quinton Byfield, 6 goals in 6 games. He's getting really, really hot at the right time. He just feels like whenever he has the puck, he's dangerous, and that's the player the Kings want him to be. Obviously, the talent is there. It's more of a mental thing, I think, with Byfield. He has the skills to drive to the net, crash for pucks, and he's a great skater. But I think, for him, it was a lot of like overdoing things, especially, right near the crease. And I think lately he hasn't done as much of that. Maybe he did a little bit earlier in the game, but in overtime, he gets that nice goal. That goal was great. It was a good setup from Adrian Kempe, who received the puck from Brant Clark, who set up a nice feed to Kempe, and then Kempe found Byfield, who was pretty uncovered by a Noonan, and he puts it in, and that's the game. And so, yeah, I mean, just a great finish to the game for the Kings. But yeah, going to what some of the guys talked about in the press conference, Mikey Anderson, like I mentioned, spoke, as well as Quinton Byfield from the players. Too many turnovers. It felt like a ping pong game. That's what Mikey Anderson said, and I would agree with that. It felt like momentum was traded at certain points in the game. The Kings had a lot of chances, not a lot of shots. Of course, those are different things, and I think that's an important distinction because LA was, the issue wasn't finding the ozone, it was finding the net. And so, you're playing in a backup goaltender who's not very good. They're lucky not to play Yusei Saros, even though he's struggled this year. And the Preds, like I mentioned, are not a good team, but they had, coming into this, had won 4 of their last 5. So, yeah, every game, though, for the Kings, Mikey Anderson touched on this, feels like a must win. And I think that's a pretty good outlook for them. I mean, it's pretty clear that they're very likely going to make the playoffs at this point. It'd be really hard for them not to, but home ice is so important. And I mentioned how good their home record is. Mikey Anderson, even, during the moments where the Kings weren't scoring, well, most of the game, and he appreciated the forwards doing a good job of getting the puck down low, at least creating chances and staying with it. And Mikey also talked about Quinton Byfield's confidence and, talked about that last game a little bit, but Byfield himself talked about his own confidence and said a lot of that comes from the trust that Jim Hiller has in him. And I think that's important because we've seen Quinton Byfield move around, the lines this year. He's really played everywhere on the wing, at center, on the first line, not, in the bottom 6. And I think for Byfield, he's a young player. Confidence is such a big thing for him, especially considering how high he was drafted. He just got the extension. Trade talks have been mentioned about him before. Those seem like they're pretty off the table now. But I think with Byfield, confidence from his head coach is very important, considering the point we are in the season where the Kings are relying on Quinton Byfield now every game to produce points. And that's because their offense is not generating much. And Byfield is that one light they have who is just so athletically skilled. He's a great skater, like I mentioned. He can get things done for him that other players can't do. He's a very resourceful player, especially on that third line, like I mentioned. And so Byfield also said he's a player who can surprise goalies when shooting. And I definitely agree with that. I think Byfield has the ability with his length and his size to be very deceptive. And I think that's something you don't necessarily see with the other players on the Kings sometimes. And it was a quick turnaround for the Predators, but the Kings knew that, they're on home ice. They have to get the win here. It's a must-win type of game. Wasn't necessarily a playoff-style atmosphere in the building, especially with the low energy on the ice. But a win's a win. It's 2 points. They'll take it. And Byfield also talked about his great relationship with Kevin Fiala, like on and off the ice. Byfield's been coined the Fiala whisperer kind of recently, and that's kind of an interesting take on it because, it took a long time for Fiala to activate himself, and he didn't show up on the scoreboard tonight, but of course he's been a big-time player for the Kings ever since the turn of the new calendar year. Jim Hiller talked about, Quinton Byfield as a whole, just said he's a good player that's getting better, and he's obviously on a hot streak, but this is really nothing new. He's been a difference maker for quite some time. And he also mentioned, because he was asked about the centers on the team and like which center is that game changer in reference to Quinton Byfield being that recently. And Hiller himself said, they have three any given night type of centers. And, he didn't want to disrespect Samuel Hellenius, but of course he's young and still developing. And so he talked about, the Kings' depth in that regard. And I do agree to some point. I think, the depth issues have kind of come on the wing. And he's right about Hellenius. He's still developing. Hiller himself said that he cut out the fourth line at the end of the game because, they just weren't getting looks. It wasn't like they weren't playing good. It's just he needed that scoring edge. So they only went with 3 lines in that third period for some of it. But yeah, I mean, he has faith in Kopitar, Byfield, Deneau, and Hellenius on some nights to, give him the edge they need. And so, yeah, I mean, Darcy Kemper has been great lately, and he's not going to win the Vezina because Connor Hellebuck exists. But, he's a guy that certainly should be in the conversation. The year he had last year, not great. And that, trade definitely raised a lot of eyebrows when it happened. And the Kings have certainly found a gem in him. Of course, he has a great defense in front of him, but Kemper made some really timely saves in this game to keep the Kings in it, and without him, they don't win this game. Back to Kuzmenko for a minute, because I forgot this point. Hiller said he just wants him to shoot more, and I definitely think that's a good point, because Kuzmenko is a net front presence. He's not a guy that necessarily is getting a lot of pucks on his stick every single night, and so I think that's a good point. And just talked about how the team needs to enjoy the challenge. Like, they're not a great team on the road. They're going to go on the road next to play Minnesota. They're going to need a lot of energy on that. That's a tough team to play. They're in the wild card right now. They're trying to catch up a little bit. So the Kings just need to stay composed and not get frustrated. That's another thing that Hiller talked about, because, the team got frustrated clearly in this game early on. When you're not scoring on the power play, when you're not getting many shots up, when you're sort of just tooling the puck around, overpassing, not playing simple, that gets to you over time. And that was clear with the Kings tonight. But they do win, 1-0 final score. And yeah, I mean, it's not a great game for them considering, they had barely any shots to start this game. But that third period was not bad. They end up with 21 total shots, and they win the face-off edge as well. So the point is, it's a win. It's an ugly win. And, you're against a bad team, and the Kings have showed this year that they can beat really good teams, but they can also kind of falter against kind of bad teams. And so that'll be interesting, but they'll go on the road for a couple of games, and they're going to play, like I mentioned, Minnesota next, and then the Chicago Blackhawks, another bad team that they've, been exposed against. So we'll see what happens there, but that's just going to wrap things up for me. As always, I'm your host, Casey Kasliner, thanking you so much for listening to Skate of Thrones. Let me know your thoughts, and make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.